Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been suggested by some that the social security system stems from beverage. I think we might reasonably argue that it stems from the 1908 Pensions Act that the Liberal government introduced, which paid the first pensions in 1909. The first political book I read was a biography of Lloyd George when I was 7 years old. So perhaps I mention it every year, absolutely. But I think the important thing about the reference I'm making is that 100+ years ago, the Times, then known as the Thunderer, definitely thundered against the iniquity of paying people without them having put something into a fund. The NI, the National Insurance Provision, didn't come along until 1911. But now we've got a consensus that we're going to support a bill which is, of course, much more wide-ranging than the 1908 Act. And that is a good and proper measure of how we have travelled in our regard that we have for those in our society. And, of course, that will be all of us, because at different stages of our lives, we have different needs, who will, at one way or another, depend on a social security payment. Now, Joanna Lamont made mention of the need for rights to be in legislation. Well, I'm not sure that they need to be. We can exercise rights that are not in legislation, and in particular, the modern concept of human rights stems from the work of Eleanor Roosevelt in the aftermath of the founding of the United Nations. In 1948, she wrote, "While words, ideas and ideals may mean little by themselves, they hold great power when properly disseminated and embraced." And I hope that this debate spreads the word about what we want to do. Now, I want to just pick up one or two particular points. I wasn't on the committee, but I've read with interest the excellent report the committee has produced. In particular, I go to 1D, which is where the bill currently says role, and it is suggested that it should instead be duty. Now, of course, we need to be slightly careful when we change a single word, and we must weigh that single word. Because if you say it's a duty, you might potentially lock out the Scottish social security system from doing top-up of somebody else's social security provision by way of financial, without our creating a new social security provision. Now, I only say might, because I haven't examined the matter in detail, but I hope that others will look closely at that. Now, Adam Tompkins is, without question, the most experienced constitutional lawyer in this Parliament. I don't think there'll be much debate about that. But, and it's quite a big but, he may have inadvertently failed to perhaps understand the practical application of our constitutional position. If, as he suggests, we should incorporate into the primary legislation more as we go forward than is currently intended, what the effect of that is, of course, is to end the discussion of the matters brought into the primary legislation at the end of stage 3, whereas having them debated and discussed in the context of secondary legislation extends the consideration that Parliament is able to give to the matters into the committee stages that will follow as secondary legislation comes forward. Now, it's particularly apposite that I make that point in relation to Adam Tompkins' remarks, because I won't, unless, well, tit for tat, if I may, Presiding Officer, but I may come back if time permits. But I think the key point too is that Adam Tompkins suggests that the government is behind the curve in its preparations for what has to follow. And yet, on the other hand, he insists that that incomplete and imperfect preparation should be incorporated in the primary legislation. And I think those two positions are pretty inconsistent, one with another. Now, legislators, and it includes every one of us here, are perfectly capable of making mistakes. So you have opportunities when it's secondary legislation to more readily correct them. And I, mea culpa, provide an example from my own experience. On the 23rd of April 2012, I signed the Snares Training Scotland Order 2012. Well, it turned out not to be quite as good as I thought at the point I signed it. So on the 22nd of May, less than a month later, I tabled the Snares Training Scotland #2 order, which was a better presentation of the legislation that was required. I also turn, and I leave this as a little mystery for colleagues to pursue, the very first order I signed as a minister with the Port of Cairnryan Harbour Empowerment Order 2007, which I signed on the 25th of May 2007. I will let members discover why the order is entirely invalid. Entirely invalid. The good news is it was never used or required. This is an excellent piece of legislation. It's a big and important step forward for the Parliament. Having flexibility in the way we deal with it going forward is not about giving the government flexibility, it's about giving Parliament flexibility. I welcome the indications that a super-affirmative procedure will be introduced at stage 2. That gives us the kind of assurance and opportunity to have extended consideration of secondary legislation. It's a proven technique that works very well. Presiding Officer.